Economies. This is Congressman Adriano Espaillat, and I want to thank you for being members of the National Partnership for New Americans and all the work that you do to help immigrants and refugees throughout the country. Your work is more important than ever. As we welcome a new administration, we also have hope that there will be opportunities to enact legislation to bring immediate relief to immigrants and refugees across the country. Again, your work is critical, and we thank you for being a member of this important organization.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and for your patience. We're so excited to have you all here today. We're going to be talking about the immigrant rights movement's efforts on federal advocacy. I'm Kerri Talbot. I'm from the Immigration Hub. And the Hub is an organization dedicated to supporting the immigrant rights movement's federal advocacy. And we convened over 100 organizations to put together a big book of administrative policies that the Biden-Harris administration can take up. So this panel will identify some of the top administrative and legislative priorities for the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. Speakers are going to share the policy asks being made to the administration and the Hill, the politics and dynamics impacting our potential for success, and ways that we can all advocate for these priorities. We will invite you in the audience to reflect on your own priorities, how your work connects to the priorities we're discussing, and also what actions you can take in the first 100 days of the new administration to make sure these policy changes happen. So I'm going to briefly lay out a roadmap for this panel by outlining what we expect to see from the Biden administration, both administratively in the agencies and also legislatively in Congress. In terms of legislation, President-elect Biden has committed to sending a bill to Congress to provide a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the US. This will give us, the immigrant rights movement, an opportunity to message strongly in favor of registering all undocumented immigrants as a primary goal of our movement. We've really moved away from talking about comprehensive immigration reform because that implies that we're negotiating with ourselves and talking about enforcement, and in favor of emphasizing the importance of legalization and pro-immigrant policies. A down payment on this vision for legalization of the 11 million would be passage of Dream and Promise Act in the House, which covers immigrant youth and TPS holders, and also passage of a path to citizenship for agricultural workers. We're eagerly waiting to see what happens in Georgia. If the Democrats are able to win in Georgia, that would give the Democrats control of the Senate. And then Biden could pass legislation much more easily. So we're waiting to see what happens in January. And we'll hear more from Sanaa Abrar from United We Dream about the legislative dynamics on this panel. We're also going to cover administrative changes that the Biden administration has plans, and also what we're still pushing them to do. Biden has committed to an enforcement moratorium. His platform says also that he will restore sensible enforcement priorities, direct enforcement efforts toward threats to public safety, and he's committed to ending workplace raids, protecting sensitive locations, and increasing oversight of ICE and CBP. So he's basically said that there will be a pause on enforcement, but we don't know the details yet of exactly what that means, how it will play out, and also what the next steps are after a moratorium. And so we're going to hear from Silky Shaw of Detention Watch Network about how we can push to have the most progressive enforcement policies possible, and hopefully really scale back detention to low levels and ultimately eliminate it. So we're also going to hear from Silky about forbearance, which she'll explain, but it's a concept of trying to make sure our enforcement system is not enforcing against certain individuals, and also we're decoupling criminalization from immigration. So we're trying to decriminalize immigration, and she'll talk more about that. In terms of affirmative relief, which means relief for immigrants like DACA, Biden has committed to reinstating DACA and exploring other legal options to protect families. We do hope to really push him on TPS and DED, deferred and forced departure, to make sure that he uses all the tools in his arsenal to make sure that as many people as possible are protected. And we're also interested in protecting essential workers in the pandemic, about 5.5 million immigrants. And so we'll hear more from Sanaa about affirmative relief. We're also expecting a rollback of many Trump memos, including a repeal of the bans, such as the Muslim, African, refugee, and asylum immigration bans, and the public charge ban rule as well that was put out under this administration. And we're going to hear more from Abide Mousavian, who will talk about these items. Then on border and detention, which Silky will also cover, Biden has committed to not building another mile of border wall and ending the national emergency declaration. We do need to work with him in terms of next steps on detention. He has committed to ending for-profit detention centers, releasing many asylum seekers from detention during the COVID pandemic, and using community-based alternatives to detention. But I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of drastically lowering detention beds and ending family detention. We'll be hearing from Gerline Joseph from Haitian Bridge Alliance about refugees and asylum seekers. Biden has committed to raising refugee admissions, ending detrimental asylum policies, including metering and the MPP program, restoring eligibility to domestic violence and sexual violence survivors and those fleeing political persecution. So we'll hear more about those policies shortly. And then relatedly, we want to reverse anti-Black policies and protect Black immigrants. So we're excited to hear from Gerline about these items as well, including TPS for African and Caribbean countries, making sure that we reform the asylum system to protect Black immigrants. And also notably, a White House task force on Black immigrants is something that many groups are pushing for, which has not yet been committed to. On family separation, we're going to hear more from Miriam Abaya about how to protect children under this administration. So Biden has promised to end the caging of children and end the prosecution of parents for minor immigration violations. And he's committed to creating a task force to reunite families. So we'll be hearing more from Miriam about children issues. And then there are many other issues. There's workers' rights issues, making sure that we have protections for workers who are in labor disputes. And also, of course, we must talk about naturalization, since that's obviously a cornerstone of this NIC conference. Biden has committed to streamlining and improving the naturalization process, making it more accessible and rejecting unreasonable fees. He has committed to revitalizing the task force on New Americans, but we would like to push for an office for New Americans. So there's a huge amount of work this new administration will need to do to change Trump policies, and we've got a lot to discuss on this panel, and we're excited to hear your questions, which you can submit in the chat. First, we're going to hear about enforcement from Silky Shaw, who's Executive Director of Detention Watch Network. Go ahead, Silky.
Great. Thank you so much for that excellent intro, Kerri. And I'm just really excited to be here with everybody today. And, I think there's a lot of opportunity in where we're going right now. And I think on enforcement, so much of the conversation needs to be about how do we shift away from enforcement, shift away from the criminalization that we've seen for many, many years, especially since the creation of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, but even before that. And I think, how do we think about immigration as something that is welcoming, about protection, about caring for people, as opposed to punishing people? And so a lot of what we're thinking about in terms of what the administration can do, and I think so much of the enforcement approach is going to be administrative, is, moving towards that direction. Disentangling the immigration system from the criminal justice system, phasing out detention, moving away from some of the criminalization that happens through the Department of Justice as well. So I'm going to lay out a few of the top priorities around some of those pieces, and definitely welcome any questions later. So on this moratorium of deportation, and this has been one of the pieces that President-elect Biden has committed to. I think the important thing to name is, obviously, we don't want people to be deported, but we also need to have an end to the enforcement programs that cycle people into detention. So a halt on enforcement, and then also a file review of people in detention, because if you have a moratorium on deportation, but you have all the enforcement programs like 287G, Secure Communities, the Criminal Alien Program, all these ICE police collaborations that happen, that means that you're going to have people continuing to be funneled into the system, and then you're going to balloon the detention system and have a bunch of people in indefinite detention. And that's not what we want. And so what we really want to see on the moratorium is ensuring that enforcement operations are halted. People in detention are having a file review and presuming release and getting folks out. And I think really day one, we want to start seeing particularly vulnerable populations, an end to family detention, releasing everybody from those facilities, an end to transgender detention, pregnant women, people who are HIV positive. I think there's a lot of discretion that the administration has to release people. And that, I think that's day one, what we need to see, especially as we move towards moratorium. Again, this is something we want, but we want it in the context where more and more people aren't going to be indefinitely detained and targeted during this period of moratorium. So I think that's a big piece to name. And then when we go into like other enforcement policies, Kerri mentioned forbearance, and the idea of forbearance is removing people from the pipeline. So there's a lot of people who are considered deportable, but maybe have something that triggered that deportation from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so could there be a statute of limitations that says, actually, if this happened over 2 years ago or over 5 years ago, maybe this person doesn't need to be a priority. Beyond that, I think family unity can be an important principle for forbearance. So how do we take people out of the pipeline? I think a lot of the frame in general around priorities of enforcement has often been a frame of who can we target? Who are we allowed to target? And I think the frame that we need to have as the immigrant rights movement really needs to push for this idea that actually we take people out of the pipeline for detention and deportation and move away from this massive system of harm that we have currently. On detention, as Kerri said, we, absolutely moving towards phase out. I think so many people agree more and more. Detention is a pretrial situation where people are there just for compliance to show up to a hearing. And it's an incredibly punitive, harmful, sometimes deathly situation. And we need to move towards phasing it out completely. I think the first steps there are ending family detention, starting to end some of those contracts. Ending private prisons would have a huge impact. Also, there's a lot of county jails that are used that also have really harsh conditions. And I think that's where we can start in phasing out those facilities. In terms of COVID, ending transfers immediately, that's really been a critical piece of how COVID has spread within the detention centers, and ending cash bond, and presuming liberty. I think in so many ways, the default is to detain more people, but we need to presume that people should be released and people should be free. And so I think that's a shift that we want to see from the administration and how they move their policies, and really promoting alternatives that aren't punitive. So alternatives that involve community-based models and also universal representation, because we know when people have resources for legal support, they actually show up to their hearings and have the support that they need. I think on the border piece, the really critical piece here is that I think a lot of folks think of detention as housing. It's incarceration, and we all know that. But think of, you have all these folks who are coming, who are seeking asylum. We have to put them somewhere. And so they think of detention centers as a place to go. I think we want to move away from that model and say, one, asylum seekers should never be in detention. But two, how can we think about other models that aren't punitive and harmful to people? And then on broader criminalization, the last thing I'll just say is, there have been an increase in migrant prosecutions. Obviously, the zero tolerance policy was a big thing that was happening. I think these recs are really for the Department of Justice to say, we need to deprioritize the Attorney General, and also President-elect Biden should put out an executive order to deprioritize prosecutions for entry and reentry, which has really just made it so much more difficult for people and put a lot more people into the federal prison system. And also end programs like Operation Streamline that really en masse bring people into that system and prosecute people en masse. And are anything but due process in a lot of ways. And lastly, at the end of the Obama administration, they were going to phase out private prisons for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Again, since this conversation has been happening about private prisons, I think we want that memo to come back and make sure that phase out happens in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but also make sure that happens for ICE detention and the U.S. Marshal Service that also use private prisons greatly. So I think there's so many things that the administration can do and move on day one to really protect people again, instead of punishing and harming them. And so I'll leave it there and pass it back to Kerri.
Great. Thank you so much, Silky. That was really helpful. Silky Shaw from Detention Watch Network. So now we're going to go ahead and hear from Gerline Joseph, who's co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Welcome, Gerline.
Thank you, Kerri.
Thank you, Kerri. Thanks, Gerline. We can hear you.
Kerri, can you hear me? I am not hearing you.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, Gerline. Thanks so much.
I hear you now. Thank you so much for having me. Again, it's Gerline Joseph with the Haitian Bridge Alliance and the Black Immigrants Bail Fund. Thank you, Silky, for highlighting all of those different things when it comes to folks in immigration detention centers. And the reality is, as you mentioned, no one should have to be in those spaces, because the reality is that is an inhumane place for people to be. And we can look into the different policies that the current administration has put in place. Over 400 different policies that have been impacting, migrants and asylum seekers and immigrants inside of this country for the past 4 years. And we can talk about Title 42, we can talk about MPP, we can talk about the Third Safe Country Agreement, among so many others that we need to look at. But we can also have to take a moment to look into Black immigrants, right? How Black immigrants are being treated, have been treated. How is it that the current system that we see is rooted and based on anti-Blackness and racism? This is nothing new. And I want to say that, as we look forward to 2021, we do not have a place to go back to. We do not have a normal to go back to. We have to be able to move forward as we dismantle the current system and rebuild better. So thank you again for having me, and we'll continue to push forward and make sure that impacted communities, voices and narratives and stories of impacted communities are highlighted, are centered. And as also Kerri mentioned, the Black Immigrants White House Task Force needs to happen. The new American office needs to happen. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we are ready and undeterred to push through and push forward in line with all of those justice warriors who are pushing for better days ahead. So we can talk about Title 42, where the Trump administration has indefinitely limited the entry of asylum seekers into the United States to prevent the spread of COVID-19. However, we see that is not the truth, right? And when we refer to as Title 42, the other has closed the U.S. border for anyone who attempts to seek safe haven since March 2020. And authorize deportation without screening them for fear of persecution and torture. And the Haitian Bridge Alliance have been fighting against, deportation during the COVID-19 and asking, the current administration to stop exporting COVID-19 to countries such as Haiti and Guatemala and others, where we know for a fact that this is happening. As of mid-May, over 60,000 people have been expelled under the policy. Of that number, only 59 people were allowed to request asylum. And of those, only 2 individuals were permitted to enter the United States to pursue their claim. DHS used Title 42 to secretly detain and immediately deport and expel unaccompanied minors and families at hotels in McAllen, as we saw on the news. Most, if not all, of the families detained in McAllen were Black immigrants, were Black families from Haiti and also other African countries such as the Congo. And most of those people have been expelled without due process. Title 42 has been weaponized against immigrants from Haiti. Haiti has always been a target for, for cruel and inhumane rules when it comes to immigration. We also see that these experiences are extremely traumatic for immigrants, families, and their children. And we are speaking about babies under the age of 1. We are seeing young girls and young boys who are 7 and 8. And as a mother of a 10-year-old, children who are at the prime of their development should not have to be caged for years, months and years at the time without access to proper medical care, proper family, decision making, and forcing them to grow up in a system where they are being dehumanized and also without any recourse. So we worry that family separation and deportation expulsion would scar these children forever. And we know that in the reality, when we do not protect those who are the most vulnerable, we cannot provide protection for anybody else. So they are subjecting babies, as I mentioned, as young as 1 year old to these cruel policies. And we can talk about MPP as well, which is a DHS policy that forces asylum seekers who have tried to come and ask for asylum, which is the lawful thing to do. I want to reiterate, are forced to wait in Mexico while their asylum claims are being processed. MPP is being challenged in a lawsuit in South California by Alotolado as unlawful. And during that time, it became clear that the policy was enacted in 2016 in direct response to Haitians coming to the border. Again, when we look into racism and anti-Blackness, as they continue to enact rules to stop people, especially Black immigrants, into coming into the country. Their lawyers also at SPLC and CCR asked us, and we submitted an amicus brief talking about the history of discrimination immigration policies dating back to the 1960s, enacted to prevent Haitian asylum seekers from entering the US. And we also see the immigration prison system, not detention. It's not a place where they put people while they are, having fun or waiting the process. It is prison. It is cages where they put people without access, most of them, to legal representation, without access to community support, without access to their families and sponsors who are already in the United States. So we see also that this system was built, the way it is, on the backs of Black immigrants from Haiti in the 1980s when they were coming through asking for asylum as refugees. So it is not a mistake that we continue to see that people suffer in those places. It is not a mistake that we see the high bonds for Black immigrants, specifically from the Caribbean, Haiti, and in Africa. We recently just paid a $50,000 bond for a young man who actually barely escaped for his life because of the armed conflict back in Cameroon, who traversed Africa to make it to Brazil and then crossed 11 different borders to make it here, barely made it, only to be put in cage and then spend there over a year and a half, and then be given a $50,000 bond to pay in order for him to be freed. So because of that, we were forced to create the Black Immigrants Bail Fund to be able to provide support to have those people released. So these are some cruel policies, cruel system that has been enacted in this United States of ours. Now we can also continue to talk about the policy, how, as I mentioned, the immigration system is based on racism. We can also talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement that bars asylum seekers who reach the US from applying for asylum if they pass through a third country before reaching the United States. The reality is migrants and asylum seekers normally go through more than one country. You know, when we take the example of Haitians, they go to Brazil and then they cross 11 different countries to make it to the United States. So what the Safe Third Country Agreement is saying is that those people should apply for asylum in countries such as Venezuela, in countries such as Honduras, where we know that our Central American brothers and sisters are also fleeing conflict, also fleeing the natural disasters, also fleeing, persecution. So how are we asking people from the Caribbean, in Africa, in other continental countries to actually settle in Honduras, for example? So we have to continue to push that. This policy effectively bars most Haitians and African asylum seekers whose migration path to the US starts from their home countries and throughout South America. The migration journey is long, expensive, physically grueling, and extremely dangerous. We at the Haitian Bush Alliance interviewed people that when they reach, Mexico, in the border of Guatemala and Mexico in Tapachula, and we will be releasing a report that we conducted with Black women who made the journey to Tapachula, and how dangerous that journey was to be able to make it to that point. The amount of people who have lost their lives is unbelievable. For them to go through the jungles, to the rivers, to the mountain, to actually barely survive should not be a death sentence for them to be put in cages and most likely be deported. Sometimes they stop and work along the way for years and months to be able to make it. The problem again with Black immigrants is that when they travel in those Black bodies, they cannot be protected. They cannot pass as Central Americans because the moment they show themselves, they know they are migrants. So the Trump administration would like to ban all of these people from applying for asylum because they could not have applied for asylum anywhere else. But most of these people never intend to get stuck at the border. They didn't know they were going to die on the way. But the hope that we in the United States have been selling the world, that we are a nation of freedom, of liberty, in the pursuit of happiness, give them hope. So we continue to make sure that they are protected. We continue to make sure that the new administration, within the first 100 days, will stop deportation, will provide a pathway, a secure protection for asylum seekers, will take care of our TPS holders, will continue to provide protection for those who are in need. And please do not forget our essential workers. We knew we were essential long before there was a sentence of essential worker. And with that, I will say that, this past couple of weeks have been hard for me and my family. As my aunt just passed away as a TPS holder, her only wish was to be able to see her mother again. But because of the fear of termination of TPS, she was unable to go give a last hug to her mother. And she was hoping with the new administration, in January, in March, in May, maybe this summer, she would have been able to go see her family as she battled cancer. And as a frontline worker, as a CNA, her dream was to be able to go see her family. But the fear of not returning, the fear of terminating TPS made it impossible for her to go until she passed away a couple of weeks ago. So we cannot allow this cruelty to continue. We have to push. We have to make sure that our communities are protected. And remember, even when Black immigrants become citizens of this country, our status does not protect us. because we cannot remove our Blackness from our immigration status. So to be an immigrant, to be a Black immigrant, we have to, bring all of us, all of who we are, and make sure that we are protected and understanding that when Black people are free, we are all free. Kerri?
Thank you so much, Gerline. That was really powerful. We're so sorry to hear about your aunt, but thank you for sharing that with us. And thanks for all the work you do along the southern border. It really is inspiring and amazing. So hopefully folks will get to ask you some more about it shortly. So we're going to hear next from Miriam Abaya, who's Senior Director of Immigration and Children Rights at First Focus. Thanks so much, Miriam. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kerri, and thank you for having me. So hello, everyone. I'm Miriam. I'm with First Focus on Children. And I'm going to be talking today about the priorities for immigrant children and families. So there are approximately 18 million children of immigrants in this country, making up 1/4 of all children in the United States. That's not even to include the many, many children who arrive either unaccompanied or with their families to seek safety at our border and eventually make a new life here. And while these children, of course, have unique experiences and needs, they also need what all children need. They need safe places to live free from fear. They need stable and unified families, access to healthcare, good nutrition, and education. Historically, however, children have been an afterthought in our immigration policy. But immigration policy should focus on ensuring that children have everything that they need to grow and thrive, and recognize that immigrant children are children. So I'm going to talk about priorities in 4 main themes: child-friendly welcome at the border, proper care for recently arrived children and families, family unity, and access to services for children's healthy development. So first, I'll talk about child-friendly welcome at the border. As Gerline just wonderfully mentioned, there are many harmful border policies that have impacted immigrants, including children. Around 13,000 unaccompanied children have been turned away under Title 42 expulsions, over 16,000 children put into MPP, and we have no concrete numbers on how many children have been returned or blocked under metering, unsafe third country agreements, or other fast track processing. So all of these harmful policies need to end. But beyond that, we need to reimagine welcome at the border in a way that's child friendly. Congress has already appropriated money to the government to hire and consult child welfare professionals regarding border policies. Children should be screened by professionals who understand the trauma they have faced, their immediate needs upon arrival, and can properly assess loving family relationships in a child-appropriate manner. Secondly, I'm going to talk about proper care for recently arrived children and families, and Silky got to this as well. We know from social science research that detention and institutionalized care for children stunts their growth, and it deprives them of the loving care of a specific caregiver, which is necessary for them to thrive. And this is absolutely true for families in detention as well, because what affects parents affects children. So this starts with undoing the harmful Flores rule that was published by DHS and HHS and preserving protections in the Flores settlement agreement. But it also means ending family detention and focusing on alternatives to detention like family case management that would allow children and families to be free. And for unaccompanied children, it means the Office of Refugee Resettlement needs to build capacity so that the primary model of care are small family and community-based placements for a very short period of time until children are released to sponsors. The third theme I want to talk about is family unity. And Silky also talked about this. The Trump administration's abhorrent family separation policy showed this country what immigrant families have actually known for a very long time, which is that when you separate families, you cause trauma and disruption to children and families that can last an entire lifetime. And so not only do we need redress for past separations in the form of reunification and a path to permanent protection, we need policies that preserve family unity from the very beginning. And that means ending separation as a tool of enforcement or deterrence and keeping families together and ending enforcement that negatively impacts child well-being. Family unity also means a path to citizenship for the many, many families who are already here, as there are many children whose parents are DACA recipients, TPS holders, or undocumented. And lastly, I'm going to talk about access to services for children's healthy development. A rather immediate priority is the inclusion of immigrant children and families in COVID-19 relief, particularly access to healthcare and economic supports like cash payments. We know that this is what every family in this country needs to get out of this public health crisis, and our immigrant children and families are no different. And lastly, the new administration has promised to undo the public charge rule, which Avade is going to talk about. But after that, that's when we begin the work of partnering with trusted community organizations to reach out to families and rebuild trust that they can enroll or re-enroll in public benefits that help their children grow and thrive. And it also means that families need to feel safe going to locations where they can get support, free from enforcement and with privacy protections for their information. So I'll just conclude by saying that as we advocate for these policies, we also need to advocate for certain structures that make sure that the voices of immigrant children and families are at the table when decisions are made. That means an office of children, an office of new Americans, an office, a task force on Black immigrants, a standard like the best interest of the child standard used globally, which considers children's views, safety, and well-being in all policies. And it's through these policies that we can make sure that the immigrant children and families who hold the key to policies that are needed for their growth and thriving are centered in our immigration policies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Miriam. That was really important points that you made. Next, we're going to hear from Sanaa Abrar, who's Advocacy Director at United We Dream. Thanks so much. We will hear from Sanaa starting now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kerri. Glad to be here with this all-star panel. We're in a huge moment right now of reflection post-election, of planning and organizing for what's to come next year. And I dare say on some of the subject matter that I'm sharing with you, celebrating a few of the milestones. It's no secret. We've had some wins on DACA and TPS in the past few days. Not only have we seen the reinstatement of DACA to its original form, but an announcement of the extension of TPS for several countries. And this is to credit not only the litigators who have been fighting tooth and nail to get us to this point, but the organizing magic that many of you all here in this audience have been a part of. Who knew? I probably wouldn't have been able to foresee this on September 5th, 2017, when we saw Jeff Sessions announce the ending of DACA. I would not have been able to have just the imagination to think about December 4th, last Friday, when a New York judge ruled that DACA must be legally reinstated to its original form. But what does this mean for our work for the next few months? I also want to acknowledge that we are tired. We're tired of winning. We have won in court after court on many programs that have proven to be helpful, to be beneficial to immigrants across the country without being partnered up with enforcement actions or border militarization against our communities on the southern border. We have made a point in this country to millions of people across this country that not only are programs like DACA and TPS programs that we want to keep, but we want to expand what it means when it comes to affirmative relief to more and more people. It works. It's a matter of our public well-being. It's a matter of human decency. I say all this because these programs are not safe. Unfortunately, what we've had to do at United We Dream is push eligible new applicants to apply as soon as possible. Many of us know that there is a Texas judge who on December 22nd will be hearing oral arguments on the lawfulness of DACA. Whatever he rules will have huge implications on DACA. And it is up to this next administration, as well as the next Congress, to take swift, bold, and inclusive action, not only to protect the people whose protections are under threat, but to protect as many undocumented people as possible, because Trump has clearly exploited how the enforcement agencies at large in this country will come after all immigrants, regardless of protections, regardless of temporary status. So as I kind of think about the next few weeks and the first 100 days, I ground myself in the following principles, and I encourage you to consider these as you are coming up with your organizational priorities, as you're bringing together community members and talking through advocacy, both at the national and frankly at the state and local levels. Number one, both in 2018 and 2020, this country delivered a political mandate that at least in this situation of 2020, we've delivered a political mandate that voters are all about protecting and long-term permanent solutions for immigrants, that voters support the keeping together of families, that voters who showed up in droves, particularly Black, Latinx, AAPI, and Indigenous voters throughout the country, they delivered a mandate not only to Biden, but also to Congress and to state and local governments throughout the country that our priorities should be about helping people and not harming people. It's as simple as that. Number two, our principles should be, one of our principles should be grounded in inclusive policies that are all about expansion. We are not going back to the status quo. We are not going to just be happy with reinstatement of DACA and just of individuals who've had DACA before or individuals who have had TPS before. Frankly, there is a lot of healing that needs to be done in this country when it comes to the anti-immigrant attacks of the Trump administration. And one opportunity that we have both in Congress and both when it comes to the administration is to clearly state DACA and TPS, they are the floor. We want more. I didn't mean to rhyme that, but it just happened. So when it comes to administrative actions, when it comes to legislation, we are pushing for relief for as many people as possible. When it comes to the administrative side, a temporary reprieve for as many immigrants as possible who haven't been able to qualify for previous programs. When it comes to Congress, permanent solutions for as many people as possible, because we know that as long as there are temporary solutions, we will have to continue to fight in the courts to defend their implementation and to defend their longevity. Number three, our principle should be, I call it every window, every tool. We use every mechanism at our disposal to protect people and not harm people. What does that look like? Well, on the administrative side, President-elect Biden has options when it comes to protecting people. We say that this at United We Dream, we're not married to the DACA 2012 memo. Our commitment is to our people. So anything that can be done policy-wise and using all the administrative tools in the toolbox to protect not only DACA recipients, but a larger population of immigrant youth, of designating TPS for more and more countries, of identifying creative innovations at the administrative level to allow people to have work authorization, to have travel documents, and to live with a sense of safety, at the very least protection from deportation. We are all on board for that. Same with Congress. When it comes to legislative options and vehicles, we see every moving piece of legislation as an opportunity or a window to pass a legalization for more people. We might get to this depending on our Q&A section, but I want to state here very clearly, opportunity number one will be a COVID relief package. What does it look like to ensure that immigrants remain a part of the conversation, that recovery for the entire country means that we must provide a pathway to citizenship for as many immigrants as possible? Because as long as people are locked out of pathway to citizenship, out of healthcare, out of key social supports and care systems in this country will fail to fully recover from a life-changing pandemic. I also want to note one last principle, which is the how in terms of all of these moves. We're not going to wait for Congress to act and just watch the administration. We're not going to move on Congress and tell the administration to hold up and watch what Congress does. No. This must be simultaneous. All of these moves that we make, from the policy recommendations you've heard from the previous speakers on this panel, all of these moves must be made simultaneously. It's all about the president acting boldly and swiftly, and it's all about Congress getting its ducks in a row and moving legislation that is expansive, that is not tied to enforcement or border militarization harms, and that is inclusive as soon as possible. I'll stop there, and thank you for having me on the panel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sanaa. It's been a big week for DACA and TPS, and we're excited to win more. So we're going to hear finally from Avide Musavian, who is Legislative Director at the National Immigration Law Center. Thanks so much, Avide.
Thanks, Kerri. And it's really great to be here with all the other panelists. I can really feel the extraordinary emotion and energy for all the things that we want to do in the next administration. So just building off of so many of the excellent points that have already been made, I wanted to highlight a couple of areas that fit within the National Immigration Law Center's broader platform of really fighting for the rights of immigrants to thrive. And that freedom to thrive is really essential in our view to not just recover and try to repeal all the harmful policies that were enacted and put forth under the Trump administration, but really to use this as a moment to take a step back and look at our immigration system as a whole and how immigrants fit into different sectors of society and how we can have immigrant inclusive policies across the board, not just in our immigration system. I do want to zero in on a couple of things that are really priorities for our organization and that we partnered with so many of you on in fighting for these last 4 years. The first is all of the related bans that are referred to as the Muslim, African, asylum, refugee bans. All of them, in our view, have always been part of a broader mosaic of targeting communities of color, targeting immigrants from Muslim majority countries, Black immigrants, and immigrants from poor countries as well. And so the fact that one of the very first anti-immigrant executive orders that was issued under the Trump administration is now a policy that the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, has committed to undoing on the first day is such a reflection of the extraordinary power of our communities and the visibility that so many people gave to communities that have otherwise not had that kind of visibility in the past. And so I think it's really important to recognize that while we have such a, as Sanaa mentioned, like we have such motivation to really use all the tools in our toolbox and really go after so many things that we want to undo, it's really critical to stress the importance of the fact that this is a commitment that the Biden administration made to undo the Muslim and all the related bans that this administration used, because I think it just really sends a signal to the Black communities, the Muslim communities that are impacted by these policies. We've always seen that this is really deeply rooted in using any avenue that the administration has been able to target particularly people from Muslim majority countries, the refugee numbers and the admissions that have been slashed to a abysmally low number of 18,000. That is also part and parcel in the administration's attacks on Muslim immigrants, given that in recent years, the overwhelming majority of refugees are from Muslim majority countries. So from our perspective, it's critical not just to undo the bans, but to be really expansive in the scope of these bans that are being undone. And principally, that means any bans that are rooted in the president's authority to suspend people from other countries to come into the United States. So we have seen that this authority has been used in a lot of ways, not just to target people from certain countries, but also, for example, there was a healthcare proclamation from last year that was really an attack on poor immigrants because it required people to be able to demonstrate that they had a certain kind of health insurance within 30 days of coming to the U.S. So all of those things we really want to see undone. That's sort of a very base level floor ask for the administration. We also want to see that the Department of State gets rid of any policies that correspond to the ban so that we really just see a true erasure of these policies across different agencies. We know that one of the sort of great historical shaming aspects of these policies is the fact that we'll never really know just how extraordinary the scope and the harm of these policies are. We heard from Geraldine about her aunt's dying wish to see her mother, and for so many families who are impacted by these bans, they didn't even have the ability to go to even attempt to apply for a visa because they didn't believe it was an option or a possibility that was available to them. So there are really countless victims that have been impacted by these bans. But we also know that there are people who did try to apply for visas, even with the bans, and we're hoping that they could get waivers. So to the extent that we can really do an immediate review of all of those applications of people that we do know about, we want to make sure that we give those people a fair and swift opportunity to apply for a visa without being subject to these restrictionist bans. I want to highlight also the fact that this past Congress, we were able to pass the No Ban Act, which would not only rescind all of the terrible restrictive bans, but also would ensure that our immigration laws don't allow for future presidents, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, to enact these types of far-reaching, extremely broad in nature bans on people trying to come into the United States. And while there's so much more to do beyond just building off of the No Ban Act, I do want to highlight the fact that that bill, the fact that it created criteria for future bans that did not rely on terms like terrorism, counterterrorism, or national security, terms that are often used as a proxy and sort of sanitized way of targeting Muslim, Arab, South Asian, Middle Eastern communities. The fact that we got language in Congress that did not reflect that kind of harmful framing that we've seen so many times, particularly post 9/11, that's a real victory that we want to build off of. So there's a lot to do, but we want to continue to build off of some of the successes. As Sanaa pointed out, it is surprising to frame a lot of what we have done as wins at a time that has felt very oppressive and restrictive for a lot of us, but it's really important to highlight these things as victories. And then I'll just comment on some of the things that we're prioritizing around eliminating the public charge, or what we refer to as the wealth test, on family-based immigration. So there's certainly some long-term objectives that we have with respect to trying to eliminate that kind of a wealth test on immigrant families. But absent immediate legislative action, we think there's a lot that the incoming administration can do in terms of directing Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and Department of Justice to immediately begin the work of rescinding the current public charge regulations in the first 100 days, rescind the presidential proclamation that barred entry to immigrants who didn't have a certain kind of health insurance. That's the proclamation I mentioned earlier that is also one of those bans. Direct the Department of Homeland Security to rescind the recently issued affidavit of support proposed rule that would make it harder for people to sponsor their family members. And then I think more broadly, one of the tactics that this administration so effectively used was to create this constant specter of fear of the unknown, whether it was fear that ICE might go after you as you are trying to pick up your child from school or go to a medical appointment or go to work. And also fear of the consequences of immigration consequences of going to seek basic services, whether it's nutrition assistance or healthcare. That is what sort of the public charge rule, even well before it was actually issued, and the fact that it was being discussed and rumored, and it created such a chilling effect in communities that I think there's so much that the next administration can do to really restore and rehabilitate confidence and trust in immigrant communities and service providers who really rely on that trust to be able to say, you can safely participate in daily essential activities that are crucial for you and your family's well-being without the fear that you're going to get deported or that someone's going to use that information against you to prevent you from getting a green card in the future. So a lot of that is really public education, really rigorous outreach efforts to undo that sort of constant air of fear that was really intentionally propagated by the Trump administration. I will pause there because I know we've got a lot to get through with great questions from all of you. Thanks, Kerri.
Great. Thanks so much, Avide. We really appreciate it. So now we're going to go to question and answer, and a few of you have submitted questions, which we really appreciate. So we're going to hear a little bit more about the enforcement changes that we're expecting from the Biden administration from Silky. So the question is, what are the opportunities to build upon this promise of the moratorium? So we're anticipating that there's going to be this immediate change from the Biden administration where they're going to put a moratorium, which kind of means like a pause or an ending of enforcement. And then what do we think will happen next, and how do we push them to go further? And then do you also expect any kind of like public backlash regarding this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of it is unclear right now. So we don't exactly know how it's going to be implemented. I think, as I stated, we really want this to be not just a moratorium on deportations. A moratorium on deportations actually has to be a moratorium on enforcement and a moratorium on detention. And for us, really phasing out detention. And so I think in terms of what that looks like and how that plays out, I think there's a lot of questions. They've said, 100-day moratorium. What is happening during that period of time? I think that's a lot of the question of how are we shifting the way the agency is doing things and targeting people during that moratorium, so that, at some point, if things move forward, a lot of those folks that we've talked about are out of the pipeline. A lot of those enforcement programs have been phased out. A lot of the detention centers have been phased out or closed down. And so you have less people experiencing the deportation pipeline and the enforcement. And so a lot of that needs to be things that happen during the period of time of the moratorium to, shift the system away from this very punishment model and shift it to something where, there's more opportunities for people who have file review to be released. There's more opportunities for people who would have been targeted to not be targeted. So I think that's a lot of what we want to think around the moratorium. And then on this question of, the backlash, I think so much of what we need to do as an immigrant rights movement, and then what I think, the administration will need to do, is not fall back on this policy of responding to the attacks from Republicans and what we've seen over the years. And a lot of that has been, even within the movement, a criminalization that happens. These are some folks who are deserving. These are some folks who aren't. And like I said before, I think so much of this has to be about how do we take people out of being targeted by this system, as opposed to identifying people who should be targeted. So, remembering some of the language around felons, not families, et cetera. Like, in so many ways, what this year has taught us, and what we've known before, is that these systems of incarceration and police violence and the police in general are so harmful and have funneled so many people into incarceration and then ultimately deportation often. And so we can't fall back on this idea that that system is actually doing something that we need to follow. And immigration is in a civil system where they shouldn't be in this model of incarceration and criminalization. So I think a lot of what we need to do is not fall into in terms of that backlash, not fall into that idea that some people are deserving of detention and deportation, and really think about the whole and how we're protecting people as whole individuals.
Great. Thanks so much, Silky, for joining us. Next, we wanted to go a little bit more in depth on the question of relief for immigrant communities and essential workers during the COVID pandemic. Sanaa mentioned that probably the Congress and also the administration will be very focused on COVID relief. And so we want to hear a little bit more from Gerline and from Avide about, what would protections look like for essential workers and for immigrant communities related to COVID, and what more can be done to really make sure that people are protected and provided with assistance. So we're going to hear from Avide first, and then Gerline. Thanks so much. So I see Miriam. I think we're going to need Avide and Gerline as well. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Avide.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could talk a little louder. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are now 9 months into fighting for immigrant inclusive policies during a pandemic. So we are acutely aware of the essential role that so many immigrants play in helping to care for and assist in the recovery from the pandemic. And so it's really crucial from our perspective that we really build strong, healthy, inclusive communities through policies that are immigrant friendly. And the way that some of the ideas that I want to share about how we can do that is we really need to honor and protect essential workers and their role in the workplace. They are disproportionately from communities of color and immigrant communities. And right now, we are lacking in guidance from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention on workplace guidance to protect them. We need to issue emergency temporary standards from OSHA and really support inclusive paid sick and family leave for all workers. That's one area where we want to see improvement, drastic improvement in the next administration. We've also think that it's crucial for HHS to clarify that emergency Medicaid should be inclusive of any COVID-related testing, treatment, vaccination, or other COVID-related care, and be very explicit that COVID public health campaigns, including for vaccinations, really account for the needs and specific needs of immigrant communities, whether it's culturally and linguistically appropriate outreach, providing funding to community-based organizations to be able to supplement that outreach, and serve immigrant communities in a way that really meets their needs. And also to make sure that federal COVID relief is available to everybody, that state governments, local governments, businesses, educational institutions, that they can really ensure that their community members have stability in housing, access to food and nutrition. And of course, we have sort of a live debate that's been going on for months that we hope, we don't have to continue to keep fighting for. But the fact is that immigrants have been left out of the economic impact payments from the past stimulus relief package, and immigrants, are now at risk of being left out again if there's future COVID relief bills. So we really want to make sure that the next Congress continues to fight for immigrant inclusive policies when it comes to any COVID bills, and recognizing, of course, that essential workers are such a vital part of the recovery process.
Thanks so much. And we're going to go ahead and hear from Gurleen as well, if you're able to join us about relief for workers and also relief for other immigrant communities. Go ahead, Kerri.
Yes, thank you, Happy There, for uplifting and highlighting all of those different necessities. The reality is when we look into the protection that is needed from the farm worker who is picking up our tomatoes and cilantro to the healthcare workers like our member Rose, who is a health practitioner in Rhode Island, who is at the forefront, who, ended up getting COVID by the grace of God. She survived and went back to the hospital to make sure that her patients are taken care of. So we want to make sure that these people are protected. That is the reality that we deal with. Those people have been excluded, from previous packages. If you have, for example, if you have a family member who's undocumented, that person is not covered. While we have DACA and TPS holders and other immigrants in the forefront battling the current crisis, the pandemic, making sure that the nannies are taking care of our children so we are able to do the work that we do. We have to make sure that essential workers, all immigrants, are taken care of and protected. We are asking, not just asking, we are demanding that the upcoming administration make sure that our community members are protected, from CPS holders to DACA to undocumented, to make sure that we create a fair immigration reform system for them to be included. We have to make sure that a father who is currently at Berks, who is asking our children, people too, to make sure that they have access to due process so that they can continue their asylum cases, so that they continue to be able to get a chance to prove their case and be able to provide for their family, when we have a woman who just had surgery but is being forced, to not ask for medical assistance because she will be punished, right, while she is in immigration detention centers, is unacceptable. We have to make sure that protection for one is protection for all, starting with our essential workers, our farm workers, our frontline workers from CPS, as I mentioned, to DACA and other undocumented folks, but definitely make sure that help is provided for those who are in need. Make sure that PPE is provided for our medical workers, making sure that housing, is also an immigration issue, because we are experiencing immigrants who are getting abused by their landlord because they know they might be undocumented. The fear that is within the community is unbearable. We have to be able to provide relief. We have to be able to lift up that cloud of fear that continues to keep people caged in a space of unbelievable pain. So what does protection looks like is to make sure that we hold the upcoming administration accountable to the promises they have made, to undo the pain and cruel system that has been established, and make sure we provide support for those who are in need. Kerri?
Thank you so much, Gerline, and thanks to Avide as well. So we're going to pose our next question to Sanaa. We're going to talk a little bit about a question that was posed in the chat, which was, do our speakers think that the future immigration bill of the Biden administration should be essentially along the lines of the 2013 Gang of Eight bill, or should it be significantly different, and in what ways? And this really relates, to talking a little bit more about scenarios for moving forward on legislation, and especially if there's a Senate controlled by Republicans, how do we see that going, and what are some of any trade-offs that might come up, or the group's red lines would be really helpful. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kerri. Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I think it's a helpful grounding question for where we are in this moment. Speaking as someone also pointedly who was not involved in the immigration rights movement back in 2013, I want to also ground us that bill was written 7+ years ago. A lot has happened in 7 years. Namely, I think we have to point out that during the Trump administration, what this current president has done has exploited how rotten and how wrong to the core the immigration, carceral, and enforcement system really is. And unfortunately, that 2013 CIR bill, as it was drafted at the time, would have only increased or bolstered the resources of the immigration enforcement system as we know it. That was a price that politicians put on the table in exchange for relief for a certain number of undocumented people. I want to just name how that framing has been long a part of the CIR, Comprehensive Immigration Reform conversation. And I want to also name that the way that Kerri opened this call was deliberate, in that we are walking away from CIR in everything that term encompasses. This is a new moment for us, a new chapter in terms of immigration policy, and really holding it down when it comes to moving legalization, relief, helping people, and making the system better. We also have a long-term vision that Silky spoke to about abolishing and defunding the agencies that are currently operating that will always threaten and target immigrants, particularly immigrants who are not covered by relief measures. So when it comes to advocacy next year, both with the Biden administration and Congress, number one, we're changing the rules and the parameters of the debate. This is about moving legalization for as many people as possible. This is about putting down the red lines in terms of not throwing border communities under the bus, in terms of not giving in to more funding or resources for the militarization of the borders, in terms of an inclusive pathway to citizenship that does not lock out people because of their histories or because of their interactions with the criminal legal system. It's a lot, I know, but that's what we mean when we say we are literally turning to a new chapter. I should actually say throwing out the CIR book and writing our new book on how we operate and how we move on immigration. And this is nothing new. There are many, many membership-led and grassroots groups who have been moving on these principles for a very long time. Now it's a matter of getting politicians and the decision makers to get on board with us, because anything less is just giving in to now the Trump philosophy of harming people, of exploiting an already awful enforcement system and building up a monstrous entity that comes after our people. I do want to also acknowledge that moving legislation will be a challenge no matter what, but I want to be clear that when it comes to these next few years ahead of the 2022 midterms, our goal should be set on winning. We should be clear-eyed on waging a legislative debate and campaign. We cannot wait for the midterms. There are so many unknowns in the midterms, and there will be many excuses made by Democrats and Republicans about the midterms. And we cannot afford to stay silent because our communities are bleeding, our communities are in pain, and we cannot be saved just by the band-aid of administrative relief. We have to move Congress and hold them accountable, make them feel the burden that they have to move permanent solutions, not just for the sake of DACA potentially being ruled unlawful, not just for the sake of TPS being under threat, but for the sake of a larger, broader, undocumented population that has bared the brunt of what Trump has done or has used against immigrant communities as a result of how our immigration system was initially created, as a punishment system, rather than a system based on the presumptions of liberty, of freedom, and people's ability to thrive. The last thing that I'll say is that in terms of strategy, whether we are dealing, I think strategies obviously shift when we're looking at a McConnell-led Senate versus a Democratic-led Senate. Let's all keep Georgia in our prayers, and also all y'all out there doing the work in the streets in Georgia, with sending all my good vibes to you all as well, and people across the country making calls there. But in terms of that strategy, it'll look a little different, right? I hear, I'm a proponent of ending the filibuster and seeing what we can do to really move Democrats on bold standalone legislation. When it comes to a McConnell Senate, I go back to my previous comments about using must-pass vehicles, of holding Republicans' feet to the fire, going to people like Rubio, going to people like Murkowski, outgoing senators like Toomey, like Burr, holding their feet to the fire. And our friends, I know at the United Farm Workers put it this way, asking them, what side of history are you on? What is the legacy that you are leaving behind? Nobody says it's going to be a cakewalk. It is going to be a challenge. We also have to keep in mind that when it comes to the House, we can't let Democrats negotiate against themselves on legislation for legalization. We have to stay grounded in our principles of expansion, of not just staying with the status quo, of moving far and beyond debates that pit communities against each other, or that pitch trade-offs that would hurt communities while giving some semblance of relief for other portions of the community.
Great, thank you so much. So thanks to everyone for holding with us. We're gonna do one last final wrap-up question, and folks can just give their concluding remarks, and then we will finish this panel up. So our last question is probably the most important. What can folks do to make this happen, right? This is a lot that everyone has laid out that we need to have happen in this administration. And, Biden and Harris have promised quite a lot. And so we're gonna have to have their back to some extent and also just push them to go even further. So we'd love to hear from all of you if you wanna jump in about, what folks should do, how do they plug in, what campaigns are you running? What can local governments do to plug in? So first, let's start with Avide to hear what your thoughts are.
Kerri. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, but I will just lift up a couple of the campaigns that we have been leading on. We have had the honor of co-chairing the No Muslim Ban Ever campaign for the past 3.5 years with partners at Empower Change, Advancing Justice in the Bay Area, Asian Law Caucus, Council on American Islamic Relations of San Francisco, and hundreds of organizations that have been have endorsed the campaign. And so one of the things we really want to do is evoke that same deeply emotional feeling that people felt when they rushed to airports or welcomed people who were finally able to make it back in January 2017. And to really celebrate the rescission of the bans when they happen on day one of the next administration. So please look out for opportunities to do something that allows you to engage in a way that is celebratory, that shows the humanity and joy of the communities that have been separated and harmed by these policies. It's really important from our perspective to not just frame these victories as policy victories, but to remember, that these communities aren't just victims, we're fighters. And so that's something that we're gonna be excited to help find opportunities for people to jointly participate in some digital action around the repeal of all the bans. And then our Protecting Immigrant Families campaign that also has appreciated the support and engagement from hundreds of organizations, and I think virtually every state across the country, which is incredible. And we wanna be able to not just use the campaign as an opportunity to engage on things like sign-on letters, but also really grassroots actions that you can participate in and really have sort of a more of a field focus than we've been able to have in the past when it's really been much more focused on sort of wonky or regulatory stuff. So stay tuned for more from those two campaigns.
Great, thanks so much. Sanaa, do you want to go next?
Sure, 3 main plugs. So number one, I noted the reinstatement of DACA to its original form. There are lots of people out there, undocumented youth out there who are newly eligible for this temporary relief. We're trying to get as many people through the door. So one way that folks can help us out is by going to DACArenewalfund.com and donating. The fee is $495. Which is a hefty price. And that's not uncommon when it comes to applying for relief from the US government. So you can donate, but also too, you can direct folks to our DACA Renewal Fund at United We Dream. Individuals who have questions about reviewing their documents, about how to apply for advanced parole or for new applications. Number two, we are blessed to be leading the Defund Hate campaign with our colleagues at Detention Watch Network. Defund Hate has been one of the most effective strategies, I believe, in the past 3 years to actually block additional funding from going to ICE and CBP, which is crazy, right? I mean, under a Trump administration, I remember in 2017, we thought that challenge was, we thought it was going to be a big challenge. We've blocked nearly $12 billion of additional money from going to ICE and CBP. You can join us at defundhatenow.org. And we have a sign up there for updates and joining our email list. So that's defundhatenow.org. And then the third piece is a TBD, but putting on your radars, if you haven't already heard, 5 membership-led organizations, including United We Dream, United Farm Workers, Community Change, National Domestic Workers, and SEIU will be co-leading a national immigration campaign that we hope to launch in the next few weeks to encompass a lot of these asks that you've been hearing on the panel when it comes to administrative work that we're going to get Biden moving on, as well as our legislative demands in terms of expansion and winning permanent solutions for as many people as possible. So that one is TBD, but we will be sharing out with many of the orgs represented here in this conference space information on how to get plugged in once that campaign is launched.
Great, thanks so much. And then Miriam, do you have any closing comments about how to push forward children's rights in the first days of the administration?
Yeah, for sure. So First Focus is on the coordinating committee with 10 other organizations of the Children Thrive Action Network, which is a new coalition that is defending and supporting children in immigrant families. So you can find more information about how to join at childrenthriveaction.org. You'll get information from us about what our priorities are, and CTAN, as the coalition is called, has put out our transition priorities already that you can get behind. But I think the one other thing I would say is that I think in our country as a whole, we generally don't do right by children and generally silence their voices. And we have seen across the world and the country that children and young people have really led the fight on a lot of big issues. And I think the same is true and can be more true of immigration. These children have resilience and passion and future goals, and sometimes we don't focus their voices. And so I just advocate for continuing to center the voices of children and families and what they have to say about what they want our immigration system to look like. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Gerline, do you have some final comments for us?
Yes, and I can just pick up where Miriam left, to say that we currently have a Shutdown Brooks Coalition pushing a campaign to do just that, to shut down Brooks Coalition in all the other family detention centers at Carnes in Dilley, both in Texas. We asking folks to please support the Shutdown Brooks Coalition, the Stop Deportation of Families that we have been leading with partnership with all of those people that have been on the panel. We are asking for people to please support the Black Immigrants Bail Fund. As I mentioned before, Black immigrants usually have a higher bail amount that they have to pay in order for them to be released and be reunited with their families. But we are asking really for folks to support all of those different people who have spoken before. We want to make sure that we continue to highlight and center the voices of Black immigrants in everything that we do, but definitely push forward to dismantle and build a better system of immigration. And one thing I want also to mention is that when we have essential workers, when we have people in the forefront who do not have health insurance, who are actually caring for folks, we have to make sure we have health care for all. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. And I just want to mention, the Hub likes to support all the campaigns that these amazing women are running, as well as other campaigns. So if you need help sort of plugging in or getting contacts, or you want to connect with us as part of our large Amigos network, or your state and local government need help plugging in, just let us know and we're happy to help you. Our website is immigrationhub.org, and we'll be sending out information about the action plan, which several hundred groups signed on to, that outlines a lot of these administrative priorities as well. So thank you all for joining. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to an exciting first 100 days and first few years of the Biden-Harris administration. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for including me in this year's conference. I am happy to join, albeit virtually, and I want to say how grateful I am to all of the organizations and the people who are watching for the incredible work that you have done and that you continue to do on behalf of immigrants and making sure that they're also participating in the political process. In Harris County, third largest county in the country, home to Houston, we are also 25% immigrant. We are Exhibit A of what the contributions are that immigrants can make to our community and what an important part of the fabric of society immigrants are. And I know, or I trust, that come January we'll begin to see better policies, fairer policies from the federal level, but I also recognize that we can't wait for that. And there's a lot that we need to do at the local level, whether or not there are folks at the national level ready to do right by everyone in our community. And that's why in Harris County in the 2 years we've been here, we've fought to undo many of the unjust policies that were there and push for policies that do right by everyone. One is the first ever Immigrant Legal Defense Fund in Harris County, a publicly funded defense fund that we designed with advocates, with community members, with experts to make sure it is the right amount and it is designed to be sustainable and impactful for immigrants who don't have legal representation. Another is to make sure that immigrants are included in the services we provide when it comes to COVID, not just testing, but also resources. We've worked very hard to make sure that the dollars we offer in direct financial assistance, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars for rental assistance, for financial assistance, that immigrants qualify for that, whether they have papers or not. And finally, the work we're trying to do to make sure that immigrants can compete for billions of dollars in county contracts every year. We have undergone an effort and a study and a whole office that is now being designed so that minority and women-owned businesses, including immigrant-owned businesses, can compete fairly for those contracts and for that work. And so what's most important is for us to realize that immigration is not just a convenient part of life in this country. It is central to who we are as a nation. And the contributions of immigrants are vital to our success and the success we've had as a nation. So thank you as a local leader, as a leader in a county that faces a state that is aggressive toward immigrants, and also as an immigrant. Thank you for your work.